Now, let me start off with a little secret. I was High Commissioner when Malcolm Turnbull became the Prime Minister. And as all diplomats do, I had to send a report to Delhi about what the new person is like. And I think I wrote something reasonably flattering to the effect, if my memory serves me right, that Australia has finally chosen probably one of its most qualified politicians to be the Prime Minister, and that he would be a significant departure from his predecessor, Tony Abbott, who was a friend of India, but who nevertheless had, shall we say, some pronounced idiosyncrasies. So it was going to be back to a more normal situation with Malcolm Turnbull taking over as Prime Minister. But before I begin with Malcolm, I want to acknowledge Lucy Turnbull and congratulate her for her phenomenal book on Sydney and the work that she's done really on urban development, broadly speaking. She's truly one of the great international experts in this. I also want to acknowledge Barry O'Farrell, until recently the High Commissioner for Australia in Delhi, and the really strong contribution that Barry made to our bilateral relationship. So starting, Malcolm, I want to take you back maybe 3.5 decades. You were not yet a politician. You were a bright young lawyer, or a brash young lawyer, as you sometimes describe yourself. And there was this famous case of Peter Wright, a British MI6 agent responsible for uncovering moles within MI6. And he thought that Roger Hollis, who was then the Director General of MI6, was perhaps the Soviet mole in the British intelligence. And he wrote this famous book called Spycatcher, which the Brits banned. And then Peter Wright moves to Tasmania, and he wants to get the book published. And the British object to that in its publication in Australia, which for a country that believes in free speech and all of that is interesting. Malcolm, as the young lawyer, took up the fight for Peter Wright and the publication of Spycatcher. Tell us something about that time and how that panned out.
Well, thank you very much, Navdeep. Well, the legal team for Peter Wright, I think my microphone is fixed. All right. Thank you. Yes, well, the legal team for Peter Wright is entirely here because it consisted of me and Lucy. I was 32 and Lucy was 27 or 28 or something. We're both kids, and the reason we got this huge brief was because our publishers were told by all the great barristers and law firms that they had no hope. The British had got an injunction, temporary injunction, and the publishers had run out of money, didn't want to spend anything, and we agreed to do the case for almost nothing. Yes, that's how we got the brief. And it turned out to be an extraordinary expose of British hypocrisy on an epic scale. It involved Mrs. Thatcher directly. It involved a crisis in the House of Commons. And the Cabinet Secretary of the United Kingdom, Sir Robert Armstrong, was sent out to Australia to give evidence. And he didn't have a good time in court. He had to apologise for misleading the court. We cross-examined him for 2 weeks. But there was one moment which I think all of us in politics, and Barry will relate to this, all of us, it's when you have a really good quip, which you think is funny, and others don't. And I'd put to Armstrong, I said to him about a particular thing he'd written. He'd sort of, to mislead, and I said, look, this what you've written here is a lie, isn't it? And he said, oh, no, I wouldn't call it a lie. So what is it? I said, is it just a little untruth, is it? And he said, no, I was simply being economical with the truth, and then laughed. And then he noticed that nobody else in the courtroom was laughing, particularly the judge, Because the one place you don't make jokes about telling the truth is when you're in the witness box and sworn to tell the truth.
But, from that story 3.5 decades back about Soviet spies being discovered and so on, I wanted to move to more recent kind of spies. And I want to bring it up because during your term and during my term in Australia, there was this whole bunch of stories about China's very aggressive efforts towards initially commercial espionage, followed by what I think is euphemistically was being called influence operations. But what those influence operations really meant was that China was trying to buy Ausgrid, which is their main electricity company in New South Wales. They were trying to buy a very, very large cattle farm, which happened to be next to a missile testing range. They were using their Confucius centers in Australian universities to create a certain constituency. And what I found particularly strange and dangerous was the way they were trying to subvert the Australian Chinese community towards their political ends. I mean, I remember there was this judgment on South China Sea by the Hague court, and you had this remarkable visual of the Australian Consul General in Sydney sitting with some prominent representatives of the Chinese community, Australian Chinese community, and the banner behind said, "Hands off South China Sea," in a very direct message. You ended up, I think, there was one more case, which was one of your distinguished colleagues from the other side of the politics being caught with a cash bribe, more or less. All right? So you had this entire spectrum of cash to politicians, students, community, acquisition of critical infrastructure, and you had to deal with this. We have our own issues with the Chinese, so I'm sure our audience would be interested in knowing how Australia has taken a stand.
Well, look, thank you. Australia wants to have good relations with everybody, all our neighbours, including China. We have a very big Chinese-Australian community. There would be, as we do, a very large Australian-Indian community, but there would be at least 1.5 million Australians. We're a population of about 25, 26 million who would have Chinese heritage. So, we are very much a multicultural society. I mean, just to give you some percentages there, about 30% of all Australians were born outside of Australia, and more than half of all Australians have at least one overseas-born parent. So we are, I would say, the most multicultural society in the world, and I'd like to say we're the most successful, but obviously I would say that because I'm an Australian former Prime Minister. So, China. Look, all countries engage in espionage, right? Number one. China does so on an enormous scale, on an industrial scale, and they generally don't care if they get caught. So their cyber operations are on a massive scale. You're absolutely right, Navdeep. They do go after commercial information. I reached agreement with the Chinese government at one point that they would lay off the commercial secrets. I mean, you can't seriously say to the leader of another country, you've got to stop spying on our Defence Department because, I mean, it's embarrassing. You look like a fool saying that because everybody does it. But the commercial espionage, was a major issue, and China does that at a level I don't think any other countries really do. So that's an issue. In terms of acquiring critical infrastructure, I think we were probably too easygoing until around the time I became Prime Minister. There was a change. The penny dropped that we really should be looking at the sale of critical infrastructure like transmission, like telecoms, etc., through a security lens. And in fact, you mentioned Ausgrid's a very good case in point. At that time, there was literally our federal government didn't actually have a list of critical infrastructure. We didn't actually, if you'd said to someone, what do you regard as critically important, you would have got to 10 people, you've got 10 different opinions. So I changed all that, set up a critical infrastructure unit, register, legislation, and so now it's properly scrutinised responsibly. This is actually important from foreign investors' point of view, including China's, because there's nothing worse for a foreign investor to spend millions of dollars on due diligence and negotiations and then get to the final hurdle and be told they can't buy it for, national interest reasons. So in some respects, a quick no is actually better. So you're doing everybody a favour, it's just being professional. In terms of overseas influence operations, look, again, most countries engage in that. What we object to, and my government legislated to prohibit effectively activities that were coercive, corrupt, or covert. So if you want to influence Australia and take an ad in the paper, give a speech, publish a book, fine, knock yourself out. We're a democracy. But if it's being done undercover, I'm sorry, we don't accept that. So we believe in sunlight, got plenty of it. So we changed that legislation at the end of 2017 and in 18, and that was probably world's first modern anti-foreign influence legislation. Applies to all foreign players, of course. In terms of the overseas Chinese community, you're absolutely right. There is an agency of the Chinese Communist Party, which is not a secret. I mean, it's absolutely, well known and publicly talked about. Xi Jinping has called it their secret weapon. It's called the United Front Work Department, and they seek to exert influence around the world and promote Chinese objectives, and they particularly work on Chinese diaspora communities. And they will seek to control Chinese language media, and that is something that has to be monitored and watched and resisted, because from our point of view, whether somebody has Chinese heritage or not, they should not be put under pressure by foreign governments, right? So our concern is to protect the integrity of Australian politics. We do an excellent job at making a hash of it ourselves. We don't need foreigners meddling in it.
So, did it at any point make a difference that you have a daughter-in-law who's of Chinese origin, you have grandchildren who's Chinese? Did that impact in any way your decision-making?
No, not at all. It's just a good example. Our son Alex and his wife, Alex is our son and his wife is Chinese, Yvonne, and they've got 2 lovely children. So 2 of our 4 grandchildren are of Chinese heritage. But I think it's, you can say that about another 1.5 million Australians. So it's not exactly a unique attribute. I think it's just it's part of our multicultural society. We are a very diverse country, and you cannot. Nobody can look in the mirror and say, this is an Australian face as opposed to another. Australians look like every race, ethnicity, religion in the world. And that is, that's our great strength. It's literally our greatest strength. I always used to say that our greatest assets are not under the ground but walking on top of it. And so we have to be very careful always to have zero tolerance for hate speech, zero tolerance for people who seek to drive division, and ensure that we maintain strong mutual respect among all of our citizens.
So if I continue on the theme of political influence and move to the kind that is wielded by the media.
Yeah.
We certainly saw it in Australia, the kind of influence that Rupert Murdoch's outlets, the Australian and Sky and others have. We saw it through Fox in the US, including during the January 6 violence. We're seeing it in India, where several of our media outlets are increasingly not just very shrill, but very partisan. You had a complicated relationship with the Murdoch media. Tell us a little bit about that. But I also want to probe further that in democracies where you have a free press, where do you see the balance between the freedom of press, the collusion between business and politics at some levels, and their capacity to really influence voting patterns?
Well, thank you. Look, I think that one of the... Let me just step back a little bit in time. I'm only going back 20 years, right? So it's not a long time. It used to be that to have a successful business in the media, you needed to reach a wide audience to maximize the eyeballs or readers or listeners. The Sydney Morning Herald, which many of you would know is one of our oldest newspapers, nearly 200 years old now, it was, when it was founded, it had on the front cover, front page, "In moderation placing all my glory, while Tories call me Whigs, and Whigs are Tory." And that wasn't because the old Fairfaxes who started it were particularly politically broad-minded, but they felt they needed to get everybody to read it. So all of that has changed now. And its technology has changed it, both digital technology in curated media, what some people call mainstream media, and of course in social media. So you can make a lot of money narrowcasting and with audiences that had hitherto been uncommercial. And what has also happened is that a successful formula has been what I call angertainment. It is basically about riling people up and keeping them on the website or on watching the news. And I mean, if you look at your own cable news channels, red, flashing, writing, everything is dramatic, and it is especially so with what Murdoch does. Fox News has been the leading figure in this angertainment phenomenon, and I think Rupert Murdoch, who I've known for too long, well over 50 years, has done more damage himself just under 50 years in fact, but he has done more damage than any other human being alive to American democracy, because he's created that hate-filled environment, and which has led to this extraordinary polarization. I mean, Adam Kinzinger, who is a former Republican congressman, Lucy was pointing out to me today, he'd actually described Fox News as engaging in elder abuse, because most of its audience are older, and it is just feeding them lies and hatred and animosity. And this is one of the things that's tearing the United States apart. And you wouldn't have had January 6. If any of us had written, and there's plenty of people here who write novels, if any of us had written a novel which involved a wild mob seeking to overthrow the American Constitution and storming the Capitol, you would have thought that would have been seen as extremely far-fetched. Certainly wouldn't have got into the script of West Wing, but it happened. And that's the reality that these guys have created. So, what do we do about it? Well, censorship's not the answer. I'll tell you what Australia has going for it. I mean, Murdoch has a lot of influence in Australia, particularly on the centre-right or the right-wing side of politics, but it is much less than in the United States, and I'll tell you why. There's a bunch of reasons. One, we have a national broadcaster, the ABC, like the BBC, which is, you know, everyone claims it's biased one way or another, but it, you know, its statutory job is to report the news factually and be balanced in its commentary. And it's held to account for that. That's one thing. But I think even more importantly, we have compulsory voting. So every Australian has to vote. We believe 97% of Australians over the age of 18 are on the electoral roll. You get fined if you're not on the electoral roll, and you get fined if you don't vote. And we think about 93% of that 97% actually turn out and vote. So what that means is, unlike in countries where you have voluntary voting, you don't have to go and rile up your base to get them out to vote. They've got to come and vote for you. You know, they've got to vote. Otherwise, they pay a fine. Not a huge fine, but it's a fine. The other thing we have is our electoral boundaries are determined independently and objectively, so politicians can't gerrymander. So that means most of our districts are contestable. And finally, we have what we call preferential voting or ranked choice voting, which means that you number the candidates in order of your preference. You know, if there's 4 candidates, 1 through 4. And so if nobody has a majority on the first preferences, then the person with the least number of first preferences are distributed. And by doing that, it actually enables independence to come through the middle, and we saw that recently in Australia. So I think our electoral system, and all of these features, by the way, in case you think I'm about to claim credit for them, have been around for a century. So it's got nothing to do with me. People like Barry and I and Lucy in politics have inherited them. So that, I think, makes our politics more centred and gives us some proof against the sort of craziness that you see is doing so much damage in many other democracies, and in particular in the US.
Well, angertainment is a term that I'll remember from our conversation. We have, I must tell our friends who've come from overseas, we have some anchors who sometimes look on the verge of an apoplectic attack. And I worry for them that, you know, is he going to survive the show? But the damage that is being done is pretty real. I also want to turn to something else which is doing damage, which is climate change. Yep. It's an issue that you've been passionate about. Yep. There was a point of time in your career when you were almost willing to give up your political career for the sake of your commitment to reducing emissions. And yet, Malcolm, the reality is today, Australia still has amongst the highest per capita emissions in the world. And that's despite your own tenure as Prime Minister. What stops Australians from moving faster and deeper with their cuts?
Well, look, it's a complex story. Australia's electricity sector, which is the largest source of emissions, as it is in India, is decarbonising. You know, coal-fired power stations are closing. We have a massive expansion of solar power. Nearly a third of all Australian houses have solar panels. And wind is expanding. None of this is happening fast enough. I'm very involved, as with Luce, in the renewable energy sector. We're developing a big wind project and some associated pumped hydro and wind projects. So, you know, I'm president of the International Hydropower Association and so forth. So this is my passion. The electricity sector is decarbonising, not fast enough, but I think we are now finally over the madness that I had to endure in politics with the right wing of my party basically saying climate change is a hoax. Mind you, that's what Trump is saying in the United States, so don't imagine this can't come back. In terms of our overall emissions, one of the things that's been offsetting the good progress in decarbonising electricity has been fugitive emissions from the production of LNG, or liquefied natural gas. So we are a massive energy exporter of coal, including to India, and LNG, again, including to India and other countries. But we've got to stop burning coal and we've got to stop burning gas. But that obviously as an energy exporter, fossil fuel exporter, as long as the demand is there for it, those exports will continue. But my own judgment is that those industries will die sooner and more suddenly than people think. There is a tendency to think that change is linear. In other words, if you say, you know, we're at this level of production now and we know by 2050 or 2060 we'll be at zero, you draw a nice smooth line and you say, oh, it's going to gradually decline. Life doesn't work like that. It'll be very jagged and then it will fall off a cliff. And so it's critical to accelerate the move to zero emissions energy. We've got the tools to do it. I'm doing a session the day after tomorrow with some of your India's experts in this area. It's a gigantic challenge. And, you know, actually I applaud India both for its commitment to solar power and the International Solar Alliance, which Mr. Modi invited me to join, or Australia to join, which we did, and also the really strong leadership that's being showed on pumped hydro, which of course storage is critical. If you think about it, if all of your primary generation is going to be, or almost all of it, from wind and solar, you've obviously got to be able to store that surplus electricity to keep the lights on when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
So one of the other things that India and Australia share in common is 26th of January, our Republic Day and Australia Day. With one significant difference, their head of state lives in London. Ours, at least, is in Delhi. Now, Malcolm, you were very actively involved in the Australian Republican movement. And then it kind of fell by the wayside, and there was a feeling that there was so much deference for Queen Elizabeth that you don't want to rock that boat while she's around. Now that she's passed on, where is the movement? Are you still involved in it? What does the majority of Australians feel about now King Charles in London and Governor General in Canberra?
Well, thank you, Navdeep. Well, it didn't sort of fade away. I mean, what happened was we had a referendum and we lost, unfortunately. So about 45.5% of Australians voted to abolish the monarchy in Australia, but that wasn't enough to win. So yes, that was in 1999. And I was the chairman of the Republican movement. In fact, I was a co-founder of it. And I am still very strongly committed to it and involved. So yes to all of those questions. I think I think we will have a referendum in, you know, the next, I'm not going to say 2 years, 3 years, but in the next few years in the future. The Queen's passing obviously makes a big difference. You know, Charles, look, Lucy and I know King Charles and Queen Camilla, and we, you know, obviously knew them before they were king and queen. They're lovely people. Charles is a fantastic environmentalist and so forth. You know, we were pleased as Australia to support him succeeding his mother as head of the Commonwealth, but he's not an Australian. You know, our head of state should be an Australian. It's pretty simple. Our constitution is hard to change, however. You require a national majority and a majority in 4 out of 6 states. And also, because we have compulsory voting, the virtues of which I just extolled, it actually makes a referendum difficult because people who don't know, don't care, aren't interested, who might otherwise just stay at home and not bother to vote, get dragged along to the ballot box, presented with a proposition which they haven't paid any attention to, and said, do you support it or not? And of course, if you don't know, you're more likely to vote no. So referendums are hard. We just had one on Indigenous establishing an Indigenous voice in the Constitution, which failed very badly. They're hard to win, but I'm confident we can. I'm confident a majority of Australians will support an Australian republic, but the referendum process has got to be managed very carefully. It's not easy. Our founding fathers who wrote our Constitution in the late 1800s, I think, made it too hard to change the Constitution.
You also called it a thoroughly colonial document.
Well, it is. It is a colonial document. It is. I mean, the Australian Constitution, look, in 1901, Australia was not an independent country. It didn't seek to be an independent country. Most Australians regarded themselves as British, and they saw themselves as part of a Greater Britain. I mean, it was a different, you could say Australia and India were colonised by the British, but the colonial experience, at the end of that sentence, that's it. Everything else is then different. The settler dominions were very, very different. These were British people settling in a country and which they saw as part of Greater Britain. I mean, Robert Menzies, one of our greatest prime ministers, or certainly longest serving, said in 1948, the boundaries of Britain are not on the Kentish coast, but at Invercargill, meaning the southern tip of New Zealand, and Cape York, the northern tip of Australia. Menzies said in the mid-50s, the Crown is the symbol that wherever we are in the world, we are one people, i.e. one British people. So it was a very different sensibility. Now, historians can debate when that changed, and obviously it changed gradually, but Australians do not regard themselves as British and haven't done so for many decades. Australia is a thoroughly independent country, as is Canada, as is New Zealand, and the British monarchy in the Australian Constitution is an anachronism, but it is, you're right, it's not calling it a colonial document, is like calling the Pope a Catholic. I mean, it's a fact. It was a colonial document.
Right. I have one question on domestic politics before turning it over to the audience. I mean, I find it remarkable when you look at the last, say, 10 years or 15 years of Australian politics, how many times the political party in power has displaced its own leader in something which is quite unique to Australia. You call it a spill, right? I want to understand what the context of that particular term is. But it's almost like a blood sport. I'm not saying we don't have our share of backstabbing and all, but there's a degree of subtlety about it. There's a degree of maybe shame about it. But almost the glee with which it regularly happens in Australia seems to mark you off as something different. What brought this whole...
Well, I think the British Conservatives have done pretty well lately. So I don't think it's unique to Australia. I mean, it is a feature of a parliamentary system that the majority party or parties can remove their leader without going to the public in a poll. Yes, it has been. It is a bit like that. It is a very politics is a brutal business, I'm afraid. You mentioned backstabbing. In my experience, there's quite a lot of front stabbing, actually. I remember I was in a different context, but in a commercial deal, very contested transaction in which Conrad Black was involved. And long story, read my book and read all about it. I remember I said to Black, if you want to be an assassin, you've got to have blood on your hands. And he said, you don't just want me to have blood on my hands, you want my bloody fingerprints on the dagger. I said, well, that's right. And, so you have to be accountable. But look, that's it. I mean, human beings are difficult, cantankerous, not always agreeable. And, you know, anyone who's been in politics will know that people from the outside think it's really easy. And you should, as a politician, elected official, take all the advice from your constituents humbly and respectfully. But every now and then, if pressed, you are inclined to say, look, get a nomination form, I'll sign it. I'll make a contribution to campaign fund, and then you let me know how easy it is. Because it's not.
Absolutely. And, I can't recommend strongly enough Malcolm's wonderful, wonderful memoirs called A Bigger Picture. I read them with a great deal of interest because of the insights that they offer into Australian politics. I can share that I've already recommended it to our new Indian High Commissioner in Canberra, saying, please read this before you read anything else because you learn a lot about what really goes on. And Malcolm's written a remarkably candid set of observations in that. But let me open up to the floor. We have about 8 minutes still. Okay, gentleman in the white shirt, yes, please. Yeah. Somebody will give you a mic. Yeah. Make your question short.
Yeah, yell it out.
It won't go into the... Sorry, those behind you can't hear you, so just... yeah.
Okay, right. The recent referendum on the first people of Australia was defeated 60 to 40%, with 15 million people voting. And you mentioned Rupert Murdoch and hate media and so on and so forth. I mean, do you see that play out, or is it just ignorance? But you mentioned ignorance and people having to vote and so on. But the way we see it here, or from whatever media reports we've read, is that there was hate mongering going on about they're going to come back and take control, and white Australia is going to get impacted, pretty much like what Donald Trump is doing out there in the US. So do you see that as reality? And also would like your personal take on the issue.
Okay, let me take one more question. The gentleman in the front row, yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm, for a great insight. I'm an Australian citizen as well, staying in India, so definitely, Australian face doesn't, look alike. My question was, I went to buy a book of yours, and unfortunately, I just got to know that it got stuck in our customs. Yeah, so that's a real shame, and especially when we have the ECTA treaty, the FTA treaty between India and Australia, which was, so I just want to know, what triggered that, and what is the future between, India and Australia, and how do you see it in the next, years panning out?
Okay, one question from the lady over there. Yes, please. Yes, you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for this. The question I'd like to put to you is the question about Julian Assange. And it does seem to me, with all the sort of wonderful things, the protections that we have in Australia, that there's a certain amount of cowardice that goes along with it. And so the question about Julian Assange, which does seem to me a question for gatherings like this, where freedom of speech and the importance of truth need to be addressed. So I'd very much like to have your take on Julian Assange, who stands to be extradited very soon to the US.
So, Rupert Murdoch, Julian Assange, and India, Australia.
Okay, just on the voice referendum, look, there were a lot of, there were hateful things said during that campaign. The Murdoch press was, very, overwhelmingly against it. But to be honest, it's a complex issue. I wrote a piece in The Guardian that was published in The Guardian after the referendum, which I'd encourage you to read if you're interested in at least my own perspective on it. I think it was a mistake to put that referendum proposal up. I think we could have achieved the objectives without it, and I wasn't supportive of the idea when I was in government, and I regret to say, despite the fact that Lucy and I campaigned for the yes vote, and as did Barry, I regret to trying to prove myself wrong, frankly. I regret to say my judgment when I was PM about this proposition was borne out. So, but yes, so let me move on now. The next one was Julian Assange. Well, yeah, look, I mean, you know, the Americans should let up on Julian Assange. Surely he's, you know, paid enough of a price. I'm not suggesting he's free of guilt, but, you know, you've got to remember the Australian government can't send a SAS team, you know, into a British prison and bust him out of it, even if we wanted to do so. I mean, he's going through a legal process in another country, and we have to respect that. So all we can do is make representations, and you know, as Barry would know, as a former diplomat, you know, I'm sure he was always making representations to the Indian government about Australia. You've got no idea the problems Australians get themselves into when they're overseas. Some of them are fairly predictable and involve alcohol. Others are much more serious. But yeah, so you can only, you know, put in a good word. But ultimately, we've got to respect the legal system of others. Now, there was another one. Oh, India-Australia. Yes, the most important issue. Right. Well, okay, a couple of things on that. On trade, look, our free trade, you know, agreement is obviously pretty weak. India does not have a keen commitment to free trade. You would say India wasn't even prepared to join RCEP, which is one of the weakest free trade agreements going around. It was what the trade people call a low ambition free trade deal. So India has a very strong protectionist tradition. You know, Raghuram Rajan was just talking about that in the main on the main tent there earlier. It is a, well, I mean, his view is it's been a big problem for the country. He's better qualified to talk about that than me. I'll tell you where we come from. We want a free trade agreement with everyone. You know, we have very low barriers to trade in Australia. So we will sign a free trade agreement with anybody, anywhere, anytime. And so we kept the the Trans-Pacific Partnership alive. I mean, when Trump pulled out of that is a high ambition trade deal. When Trump pulled out of that, everyone thought it was dead. Actually, Lucy and I together persuaded Shinzo Abe and his wife at dinner at our house in January 2017 that we should go ahead without the Americans, you know. And, you know, not everyone in the region thought was a good idea, but we did, and now called the CPTPP, but it's up and running. The Brits are joining it, and maybe one day India will, but boy, there'd have to be a lot of change here to do that. Generally, in terms of the relationship with India, look, Australia welcomes the strongest possible relationship with India. I mean, we have so much in common: democracy, cricket, you know, so many cultural overlaps. I mean, such a huge Indian-Australian community. Really, I think we just got to invest time in it, though. And I think the more we have Australians of Indian background and otherwise at events like this, it all helps it too. But it is we literally have no, you know, we don't have any differences as far as I can see, and we really are the very best of friends.
I'm going to take the indulgence of the organizers for half a minute because there's a gentleman over there that I'd missed out on, and he's been raising his hand for a while.
I've been raising my hand for quite a while, and
my apologies for that.
No problem. A lot of blood has come down to my heart. Thank you very much, Mr. Turnbull. You've given a wonderful broad-stroke view of what used to happen in the world when you were PM. I live in London, and Rishi Sunak has Indian connections, which are much admired. Some people admire his wife's connections rather more. But he has a slight problem with a tiny place in Africa called Rwanda. Where has he gone wrong, or where could he go right if, as an Australian ex-Prime Minister, sir, you may have been around when the Nauru system started? End of question.
Yeah, look, I'm very familiar with that. Let me, and I'd hesitate to give, as I said, I've done I did just under 3 years of running my own country, so people have divergent views about what a good job I did. I'm not going to give people advice on running other countries, but just say this as a general rule. The public expect their government to control their borders. Anyone who imagines the contrary is kidding themselves. You need, as a government, to be able to control who comes into your country. And as John Howard said, and the terms on which they come. I mean, that is part of your sovereignty. And so, and if you are seen by the public as not having control of your borders, you fuel right-wing extremism, and you can see that in Europe. You saw that, I'm not saying the Brexiteers were extremists, but, immigration was the big, concern about immigration, foreigners, aliens, coming into the country. All of that fueled that anxiety. So I think you've got to control your borders. Now, having said that, doing it is easier said than done. I mean, absolutely, you've got to have a generous refugee program, generous humanitarian program, but the government has got to be seen to be in charge of it. We have the advantage of being an island, a long way compared to the UK from other places, and we have been able, with some pretty tough policies, to keep our border secure in the sense that people smuggling, we still have people, seeking asylum in Australia all the time, but we've basically stopped the people smugglers trade. A lot of people say Sunak and others are trying to emulate the Australian model. I think the only way Britain could do that is if it was towed further out into the Atlantic, and that seems unlikely, and waiting for some form of continental drift is not going to help. So, but it's a real challenge. I mean, Angela Merkel's generosity and compassion that allowed 1 million refugees from the Syrian conflict to basically walk into Germany, that fueled the AfD, it fueled Brexit, it fueled one right-wing, program after another. So you've got, this is a dynamite political issue, and I just have to say, speaking as someone who used to be absolutely in the front line in politics, the public expect the government to do a bunch of things, and one of them is to control their borders. So if you don't do that, you're playing with fire.
Thank you very much for that very honest and thoughtful response. Big hand, ladies and gentlemen, for Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull.